Coming up, the New York Football Giants have a critical game on tap this week against the Washington Commanders, but they need reinforcements as well. OBJ takes flight to New Jersey to meet with the New York Football Giants about a potential reunion. What does that look like? Do we want it? And how long do we plan on having him stick around potentially? We'll also break down the playoff odds picture, the teams that stand in the New York Football Giants' way, and even some injury updates potentially for Big Blue as we circle the date to take on the Commanders on Sunday. Yes, friends, it's OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where, of course, we are your hosts over here, Adam Marbrecht, breaking down the Brooklyn Nets on the Locked On Nets podcast. And yonder there is the healthy, wealthy, and wise, the seasoned generational ticket holder, Mr. Andrew Makowitz.
Adam, I'm feeling good. I don't have any flights today. I know one Odell Beckham has a flight. Let's hope that he actually gets on it. It gets to New York safely, and maybe we'll have something to talk about later.
You better believe it, man. And obviously, hopefully no flight attendants have any issues. Maybe Odell keeps himself awake for those extra couple of minutes, whatever it takes. There's something that I want to get into specifically around OBJ just from a pure football standpoint. But before we do, he is coming to town. And I honestly do not. You got him. You have us. You have the Dallas Cowboys, and maybe even the Bills as being one of those other teams there. It seems like it's down to those three. And I just don't realistically see a world where the New York Football Giants are going to be the landing spot for Odell Beckham Jr. Now, I do think that there is a very specific way that he can get there, but I just think the Giants fan base is getting a little bit over their skis hoping for this.
Well, everyone keeps going back to Odell Beckham and saying, like, he wants a Super Bowl. He wants to win a Super Bowl. He's going to go get a Super Bowl. And it's like, it feels like there's probably more to this story than just the Super Bowl. It could be like money. It could be business opportunities outside of football. It could be, where do you want to live for the next 2 or 3 years? And so, like, there's a whole bunch of different things that we're trying to take into account. We're trying to read into Odell Beckham's mind, which is always a challenge because he is a slightly mercurial individual. But what I do think is interesting is Josina Anderson, who seems to be plugged in a lot with a lot of Odell Beckham related things. She's like, my mom always told me when there's headwinds, going some way, believe in them, take them, and it's basically like gonna happen. She basically intimated that him going to New York, like, this is where he ultimately wants to be. I'm curious though, Adam, like, I think there's a better chance that he signs with New York than most people. Like, I've been wanting this to happen for 18 months. I've been willing it to happen for 18 months. And here we sit 18 months later, and we have Odell Beckham coming in for a visit. I'm just excited that we finally got to this point because of all the shame and ridicule that you put on me on this podcast for so long for thinking this would even get to this point makes me feel pretty good.
Yeah, just because they're two totally different versions of this story, where the other 17 months where Andy was hoping and dreaming on this was completely unrelated to circumstance or what was happening with OBJ or what was happening with the Giants. He just wanted to have Odell Beckham Jr. back. Listen, to me, the biggest thing standing between Odell Beckham Jr. and the Giants reuniting is Sunday's game against the Washington Commanders. If the Giants go out, because he's not going to sign before Sunday, barring him coming in here and it being one of those, once he gets in the building, you don't let him leave. And that's really not what this is, right? This isn't like the all-time free agent in the offseason, Aaron Judge going to the San Francisco Giants and then being like, hey, we're going to make you an offer you just can't refuse. Like, it's not really at that point. And if you're Odell Beckham Jr. in the short term, and there's multiple facets to this, but in the short term, if the Giants lose on Sunday to the Commanders, you kind of don't have anything to play for, potentially, with the Giants, right? You'll be in that razor-thin margin like we talked about, holding your hat in your hand. Now, would OBJ potentially be the savior of the season for the Giants? Certainly. The one thing we don't know about this is, when is Odell Beckham Jr. actually going to be able to play? Like, he has to get into it with the team. They're going through the medicals. They're looking at how healthy he is coming off the injury. If you are the Bills or you are the Cowboys, your selling point is, dude, you come and join the team. You can take the next 3 weeks, 4 weeks to get healthy. You don't even have to necessarily play in the regular season for us. It's about getting to the playoffs, and all of a sudden you show up and you catch maybe a couple of balls, or you pull a safety away and CeeDee Lamb gets to make the big catch, or Stephon Diggs gets to make the big catch. And this all does tie into winning, right? Winning football. And I don't think you're entirely off base in the sense that, like, is this solely about football for Odell Beckham Jr., or is it the bigger picture? But if the Giants lose on Sunday, I think it dramatically drops the percentage chance that OBJ would want to come here. And I know you're going to push the contract angle and the longevity angle and the everything other than football angle.
Well, not necessarily. I will do that in a second, but I mean that's coming. You know it's coming. Yeah. It's coming like a freight train on this podcast. But what I will say is, you alluded to it before, the idea of like Joe Schoen can't, quote, the way it signs, Joe Schoen, quote unquote, can't let Odell Beckham leave the building. Like, is it one of those heroic stories where it's like,
he
had all these,
disagree with that,
and he just decided it was too good. Yeah. To be honest with you, Adam, the way that Odell Beckham has set up these visits, I believe that Odell Beckham wants to be a New York Giant, because the way that he structured this is to say, New York, I'm giving you the first crack at this. I'm giving you the first opportunity. Oh, don't let me leave. I have one leg out the door. Don't let me leave. He wants the Giants he wants to give the Giants every opportunity to sign him. And like, because if he wanted to go to Dallas, he would just go visit Dallas and sign with them. Instead, he's going to New York, which everyone's like, that's a weird fit. But like on that,
really? Okay.
The way he structured this, he's like playing hard to get with the Giants, saying, don't let me walk out the door. I actually want to be here.
Totally. Let me throw out another weird scenario, since that's what you're discussing here, and rather than just be he scheduled his visits the way he scheduled his visits. But let's say that he's using the ex-girlfriend to make the new potential suitor really want to up their offer. I'm going to visit New York. Hey, when I come to visit you, Dallas and Jerry, and I just went to your division rival, and you are trying to make a playoff push here. Out of these two teams, it is far more critical for Dallas to have success this season, for them to have success right now, for them to win a playoff game. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to my former team. I'm going to go to the Giants. I'm going to have that feel-good story out there. Maybe they're going to say, hey, if we were thinking about it, we could put a little bit of money in a second year for you because we're going to have more cap room there. And then when we get to Dallas, what do we know for sure? That Jerry Jones is the kind of guy that will do something insane, like maybe say, we'll pay you $6 million for the remainder of this season, and then we'll throw another $12 million on next year, whatever it may look like, right? The point being is, like, you put a little something in the water here to suggest, hey, here is a team that could directly stand in your path to making the playoffs and having success. So when I walk in the door, you know exactly where you stand and where the bar is being set. Like, I don't think it's unreasonable the way you're saying it, of like, hey, first crack, if you want me, you can have me. But what about, like, okay, you said that scenario.
But wait, Adam, you brought up a really good point there about Jerry Jones. Like, you've seen Micah Parsons, you've seen Dexter Lawrence, you've seen you've seen Jerry Jones. Everyone is swooning over Odell Beckham. They want to sign him. They are out there being like, we need you for the championship run. If you're saying that Jerry Jones is kind of that crazy, irrational guy, maybe they'll give him $6 million. If Odell actually really wanted to go there as his first choice, he would go to Jerry World first, and he would say,
it doesn't matter. No, it doesn't matter. Why does it matter?
Because what I'm saying is, Jerry would say, Odell, I'm not letting you leave the building. What is the check that you want? And he would let them write it. Because the second that Odell leaves the Giants and goes on his tour and goes to his next team, the Giants have lost leverage. Odell has lost leverage against Dallas because Jerry would just turn around and say, why didn't you take the Giants deal? It wasn't good enough.
No, they wouldn't. No, they wouldn't, because we don't know that offers are being made when he takes these visits immediately. That's my point. He goes to visit the Giants today. It doesn't mean the Giants are saying, here is our offer. Let us know what you think. When he goes to Dallas, it doesn't mean they're automatically, instantly making the offer. Now, it's most likely that they're going to talk framework around that for sure. But these are the visits. Nobody said, like, right, like it's going to be loosely discussed. And by the way, if it was going to be Dallas, if it's going to be New York, if it's going to be Buffalo, the fine details, those are going to get ironed out in the next 2 or 3 days after these visits when he says, this is the place that I want to go play. And this is kind of my point about it, because you're breaking it down to the soups and nuts of it, right? The nuts and bolts. You're not talking about the emotional tie of Odell Beckham Jr. to the Giants. You're saying the Giants desperately need him. Don't let him leave the building, right? Okay, fine. But the point that I'm making is that Odell Beckham Jr., when you think, I'll tell you the other side of it, because we talked about Jerry Jones. What about Joe Schoen suggests over the course of his first year as GM that he is going to make a desperate move? Nothing. He didn't make any moves at the trade deadline. He actually, looked at the possibility, didn't give anybody up, but didn't bring anybody in, didn't make any big, bold moves. They stood pat, and nothing about their team looks different than it did at the deadline to now. They had the injuries they went through, but all those guys are coming back healthy here. The record was as strong then, stronger than it is now. And they knew exactly what they were dealing with in a pseudo rebuilding year here for this team. So that's the other part of it too. Like, everyone's like, oh, this is your guy, you can't let him leave. Again, the Giants are not desperate for something this season. The Dallas Cowboys are. The Buffalo Bills are. And that's why, again, I think it is intriguing that the Giants are even in this conversation. That is incredibly intriguing. We've heard Sterling Shepard and Saquon Barkley are still very close with Odell Beckham Jr., 100%. And the world where OBJ wishes he had never been traded away, which wasn't his choice. He signed the contract, and then Gettleman kicked him to Cleveland. I get that part of it. Like, so I'm not curtailing the kind of the value of the Giants being in this group, but a lot of things also point in the opposite direction.
I agree with you. And that's where actually I think the Giants have a leg up, because we talk about the contract structure that you mentioned earlier that I've been thinking about. The Giants have no cap space this year. They're so hamstrung that Joe Schoen couldn't make any moves. Like, even if he wanted to, you see like the Linval Joseph signings, you see the Ndamukong Suh signings. The Giants literally had no money to make any kind of defensive line cornerback moves. Like, they literally have been hamstrung. The nice thing is the Giants have quite a bit of cap space. And in Joe Schoen's mind, he may say, look, if we can get Odell in the building, we don't necessarily know where he's at today. We don't know what he's going to contribute this week, this month, even this season. But if we can get him on a 2-year or a 3-year deal where cap space opens up, and all of a sudden we're getting Odell Beckham planning for next season, and say you're paying him, I don't know, $8 million next season, look at the type of numbers that Zay Jones and other guys are getting on the open market. Joe Schoen might look at it and say, I have the cap space. Why don't I plan for the future while almost giving us a free lotto ticket for this year?
Okay, so let's look at this from two angles. One, remember Amari Cooper got the big contract from Jerry Jones, and then ultimately they traded him because they had CeeDee Lamb waiting in the wings. But Jerry Jones is very willing to spend money and overspend money at times. The Giants are coming out of a regime that spent way too much money, especially in free agency, and has really hamstrung the franchise. So those are things working against them. Specifically, I want to make something really clear. I always loved Odell Beckham Jr. when he was with the Giants. We never associated, the kicking net antics, whatever. That was always such a subplot point. I'll go to the most important point, that Odell Beckham Jr. is 30 years old right now. He'll be 31 next year, and mid next year, because he just turned 30. But when you go in and look at his stats, let's just make it clear here. The guy has missed a lot of time due to injuries over the course of his career, going back to 2017 with the Giants, missed a lot of time in Cleveland, 7 games in 2020, missed time with the Rams when he was there as well. I'll go ahead and note, man, his catch percentages going from his rookie season, 70, 61, 60, 61, 62, 55, 53, 53, 50. Like, this is the other biggest part of this, specifically when you talk about a 2 or 3 year contract. What is Odell Beckham Jr.'s true value as a wide receiver right now, right? Like, you can go look at his career numbers. Like, I loved Odell Beckham Jr. as a Giant. He is not one of the all-time great wide receivers in the NFL by almost every metric. The one is touchdowns, and that is something that the Giants struggle to get out of their wide receiving room historically over the last handful of seasons. But catches and yardage and everything else, he's not one of the all-time greats. And that's what it feels like. That's the way Giants fans want to treat him now. And it almost feels like an Eli Manning scenario where you got to make this up because Dave Gettleman did the bad thing, signed him to the contract, and then traded him away. And back then, you and I even said, listen, you can not sign him to the contract, and we could examine that as we might. The weird part is when you sign him, give him the guaranteed money, and then trade him away and make it worse for your franchise. That's my biggest concern here, is that Giants fans are looking at Odell Beckham Jr. and saying, Odell Beckham Jr., 2014 rookie campaign, as opposed to what he really is, right? So if you're going to sign him to a 2-year deal, 3-year deal, you're potentially talking about paying a guy what? And that's what I'll put it back to you just to clarify. It's like, what does that contract look like? 3-year contract. What are you paying Odell?
So that is it. So you've brought up the question that needs to be asked. If there's anyone that doesn't want Odell Beckham, I can understand it if you're saying,
oh my God.
What?
No, we're 15 minutes into the podcast. We're still talking OBJ. I didn't know this was going to happen.
Because he's the hot topic. He may not leave the building, as we've talked about before. The thing you brought up is very valid. If you think Odell Beckham's skills have diminished to the point where you don't think he can help this team win games, then I think you draw a hard line in the sand and you say, listen, we just don't know what we're going to get from you. Another team is going to have to put some irrational number out there, cough, cough, Jerry Jones, in order for you to sign for that amount of money. For me, I do think,
let's call him an injury risk high 2 receiver. Is that fair? Do you think that's fair at this point of his career?
I think that's very fair. And you look at a guy like Russell Gage, who's 26 years old. He's a few years younger. Just signed his deal. 3-year, $30 million. That's $10 million per year. I think that there's a structure for Odell Beckham and the Giants where it's you pay him whatever you can this year. You maybe have some bonuses and incentives next year, but I think he's going to get $10 million next year, as part of his contract. So I think you probably need to have a 3rd-year option or something for him to be able to want to sign up for that. So my idea is like whatever you could pay him now, and then a 2-year, $20 million deal after that is what you probably have to offer him. Yeah. Now I'm saying you may sit there and Joe Shea may sit there and say, that's too rich for my blood. We haven't seen you play. We don't know if this is going to be a possibility. But I think that's what it's going to take for someone to bring in Odell Beckham, is because a number 2 wide receiver is still getting $8 to $10 million on the open market. And if we're saying he's a high 2, he's worth the risk at that point for some teams.
Yeah, for sure. And again, like if Odell Beckham, if you told me I got, 17 games listen, everybody gets hurt. So let's just say you told me I got 14 games out of Odell Beckham Jr. next season where he's healthy, on the field, available, even whatever iteration of he is at his season, can still obviously be a high impact player and really help your team. It's just, you don't have a full guarantee on that. Remember, like, even though he's taking these visits now, it's because his health and being ready to be able to come back got delayed by several weeks. Originally, it was supposed to be like, hey, this guy can be back in the middle of the season, right around that trade deadline, right around the bye weeks for a lot of teams. No. Now it's going to be pushed back to weeks 12, weeks 13. And again, we still don't know how healthy he'd be this year. And I'll go that extra mile with it too. Because if OBJ is not going to be ready until, let's say, week 17, week 18, or ultimately the playoffs, if you're Dallas, if you're Buffalo, all the sense in the world. If you're the Giants, then what you're talking about is bringing a guy in for pennies on the dollar this year because you don't have any money, and then pushing money you're going to pay him off to next season or the next 2 seasons for what you think he can. If that's the idea, is what he can be for you next year, then there's no reason for the Giants to bring him in. The only, the true value here is I'll pay you, like you said, I'll pay you incentive-based contracts, could be up to $20 million over the next 2 seasons for the possibility that you can actually help our team secure that playoff spot this year. We want the feel-good vibe. And whatever happens after that is kind of fine, because we're thinking maybe it's the final game of the season and the Eagles haven't locked up that number 1 seed, and we need the win to make the playoffs, and OBJ makes the spectacular catch to push the Giants over the top. Like, that's worth it. There is a financial value to that if you are the New York Football Giants organization. A playoff game, while albeit would be on the road, like, that matters to the fan base. So there's value there. But I'd have a really hard time doing more than, we'll sign you this year and we'll put in an incentive-based contract for next year. And we've talked about this sometimes even with like Saquon Barkley, which is different. But hey, it's worth all the way up to $12 million, but the base is about $6 million. Like, I'll put you at the base of where we were talking about the other day, the top of where we would pay maybe a Darius Slayton to still be a part of this team at $6 million. That's where your floor is. And you can double that by having 60 plus catches, by having 1,000 yards, by having 6-7 touchdowns. But if you don't get that mark, I'm not comfortable financially dumping money down the drain again next year on a player that may not be a key contributor, all predicated on nostalgia.
Yeah, the last thing I will say on this, and then we can switch over to the playoff.
And I'd be excited, by the way, just to be clear, if he came back to the Giants, right? Like,
of course, that's the way it is. The last thing you need to look at, Adam, is what is the free agent crop of wide receivers next season? Because if this isn't a short-sighted move for Joe Schoen, you need to think about what are the alternatives that are going to be available on the market. Because if we pass on Odell Beckham, we're still going to have to sign at least one wide receiver in free agency. I'm sure he's going to have to go into the draft and get another wide receiver, knowing that, Sterling Shepard isn't signed, Wan'Dale Robinson is hurt, Kenny Golladay will probably be released, Darius Slayton is a free agent. We don't really have any wide receivers under control. So getting Odell Beckham now frees that position up to be able to say, at least we have one formidable wide receiver. And Adam, the crop of free agents is Juju Smith-Schuster, Jacoby Myers, Alan Lazard, Mac Hollins, and our Darius Slayton. So we're talking about no legitimate ones, maybe some twos on the market. And those guys might be $12, $13 million just because of supply and demand. So if you can get Odell Beckham a little bit cheaper than some of those guys, maybe it does make sense long-term for Schoen.
Yeah, there's a relative value there. That makes a lot of sense too. Like, whatever OBJ may not be, obviously compared to any of those, top available wide receivers in free agency, he obviously has a ceiling that none of them have ever sniffed, right? I guess maybe Smith-Schuster had like 1 year in Pittsburgh where it like really exploded, but from a consistency standpoint, yeah, for sure. Like, the untapped potential. I would still lean that the Giants, it's like, you're probably right when you look at the NFL and we know number one wide receivers and maybe the Giants have to spend big money somewhere. But if they're not, but it's almost to your point, like if they're not available next year, I'm drafting 2 wide receivers in the draft class. I'm Wan'Dale Robinson coming back healthy. And maybe you're right, though. Maybe just having at that point, like, I'll put it this way. If you said OBJ was brought in on whatever, let's call it 10, let's just say it's 10 million, right? 10 million for next year. And you draft 2 wide receivers because you got to fill out the room anyway, and you have Wan'Dale and maybe Slayton is or is not back, that can be like the 1 year Band-Aid. Maybe even you do bring back Darius Slayton, right? Here's 4 receivers. One of them has a history and a track record. The other one is kind of flashed in Slayton. We have the 2nd year man in Wan'Dale, and then we got 2 rookies that are going to develop over that year, and the following year you continue to turn it over. So there's definitely a path there to move forward with it.
Keep in mind, last thing, Art Stapleton has said this before. He would put, if he was a betting man, he would bet that Sterling Shepard will be back with this team next season, even though he is a free agent. Wow. Just saying, like, the continuity.
There's only one important wide receiver that needs to be brought back to the Giants. It's Sterling Shepard. Yeah,
exactly. And the fact that he is, like, if they're expecting him to be back and he is close with Odell Beckham, there's a lot of dots that you can connect here about what this wide receiver room can look like next season. So keep in mind, there are a lot of things in flux right now, Adam.
Let's connect the dots where Odell Beckham Jr. and Sterling Shepard are wide receivers for the Giants, and they historically get injured every year, and then the Giants don't have wide receivers. Yeah, let's not connect those dots too hard if you're optimistic about his return. We'll see what happens, man. Like I said, I like feel-good stories away from football. We'll see what happens over the course of the day. If something does break, like not being able to leave the building, we'll try to hop back in and do a bonus live. Go ahead, what do you got?
Oh, no, I was going to say, but we talked about the long-term vision because you and I both agree that Joe Schoen has been looking at the long-term view of this team. He didn't make any short, rash decisions. Bringing in Odell Beckham could potentially help in the short term, depending on how healthy he is, because the Giants are still in this playoff push. They have a huge game coming up against the Commanders. It seems like the playoff picture is starting to take shape, Adam. And we talked about musical chairs because it's an easy one for people to think about. There's 7 playoff spots potentially, right? And there's probably 9 teams that maybe have a fighting chance at getting it. I know that you looked up some of the percentages and odds. Hit us with how many teams do they realistically think have a shot at the playoffs right now?
New York Football Giants in this playoff making landscape have the toughest remaining schedule in the NFL. Always good to note that when you're looking at these numbers. 9 teams. Yes, 7 teams are always going to make it with the 4 divisions, the 3 wild card spots. So 9 teams are considered to be in the playoff picture. Now, easy ones to go with would be like the Eagles, the Vikings, and the 49ers. They're all at 99, 99, and 98% respectively. The Cowboys are at 99% to make the playoffs. That's one of your wild card teams, obviously. And then we talk about what would be the last,
Probably
Tampa Bay Buccaneers. There you go. I'm like 5-6 record. Who could possibly be getting talked about the playoffs with a 5-6? Oh no, it's the NFC South. They have a 73% chance to make the playoffs in the NFC South. So then you get into those other wild card spots. And that's where the Commanders come in. They're sitting there at 63%. The Seahawks are also sitting there. They're at 68%. So you see how close those margins are with Tampa Bay. And then you've got a bit of a bottom dweller in the Atlanta Falcons. Bit of a sleeper there at the 9th. That's the 9th team, by the way, though. 18%. So that means that there are 8 teams. And realistically, when we talk about the wild card, it means that there are 4 teams vying for those 3 wild card spots. Andy, I left out the Giants percentage. Why? Because it's the lowest amongst those 4 teams at 58% chance to make the playoffs. Right now, as it stands, beyond the Commanders being one of their biggest hurdles to get over here, and the most important one, it's the Seattle Seahawks that represent this other big issue out there and how they look over the remainder of their season as well. When I talk about the percentages, I know it's silly. It's more just about the schedule in front of you. And if the Giants win this game, these percentages can go absolutely bonkers for both them and Washington. But how do you just initially feel when you see that the only team the Giants have a better chance of making the playoffs than is the Atlanta Falcons?
Well, I will say 58% means they're more likely to make it than not. So let's just start there. So
which is hard, which by the way, is a little bit hard to acknowledge given that there's only 7 spots and there's 8 teams that have a better chance to make it than to miss it. Like there's four wild card teams that have a better chance to make it than to not make it, but there's only 3 spots. So something about these numbers does not add up.
Yeah, there's something there that doesn't necessarily add up. You know what? Like I'm not the biggest mathematician, but it's like, maybe there's a 20% chance the Commanders don't make it and a 20% chance the Seahawks don't make it if the Giants makes it, which means that they're more than 50%. And then you also have to take into account the Bucs are 73%, but the Bucs are under 500. They have to win their division, which is why Atlanta's in there. They don't break it down like what are the chances Atlanta makes the wild card spot. So there's like all this convoluted stuff that doesn't really make it as crystal clear as possible. But the short answer that surprises me first is we're 4 percentage points behind the Washington Commanders. And that would make sense because we're a 1.5 to 2 point underdog in this first game. It feels like this game is going to hang in the balance between who goes down to 40% and who vaults up to 75% in terms of who's going to make the playoffs.
Well, and the other interesting thing, too, again, remember, so I wanted to hit both the Commanders. We did this last episode, but we'll just reiterate it. And then also the Seattle Seahawks, because they represent a big roadblock potentially if the Giants lose this game, let's say, to the Commanders. But in the Washington Commanders, remember, like you talk about those percentages dropping and the Giants percentages rising. Obviously, there would be a correlation there 1-to-1. But remember, they come right back out and play the Giants again after their bye week. And then they have, and this is why it is interesting, San Francisco, and this is why you need Seattle. This is a razor thin. Do you kind of need Seattle to win some games so that maybe they're still vying for the division so that San Francisco needs to keep playing their games when they host the Washington Commanders. And then you get the Cleveland Browns who are getting back to Sean Watson. So it's interesting to think about the hardest, most difficult percentage road down the stretch of the season. The Commanders don't have an easy one either. If anything, it's probably looked at less so because they have the Giants here back-to-back games with their bye week sandwiched in between. So that's the one factor is like, if the Giants win this game, then everything gets pinned right on the next game again, really, for both teams, but it's going to be only the next 2 games that Washington plays. And the other one, just quickly, that I want to make sure we noted here was the Seattle Seahawks, because they're going to find themselves coming out here. They could still they're only 1 game out from the division right now. So week to week, it could fluctuate, which would almost be a bad thing for the Giants because it means that both those teams are winning alternately and ending up at 9-10 wins potentially. But they're going to play, as we mentioned the Rams, then they'll have the Panthers. So it feels like 2 easy wins. They close with the Rams, again. And then they have San Francisco head-to-head and Kansas City in between. So it just feels like the Seattle Seahawks might be on the path for a 3-2 record over the final 5 games and a 9-win season. If they have a 9-win season, we know the math. The Giants need to get to 2, but they need to get to 3 because Seattle has the tiebreaker. That's the big problem here for the Giants and why these Commander games are so critical. because if it's going to be against the Seattle Seahawks, don't try, go ahead, Andy. Paint me a picture where the Giants get to 10 wins over the remainder of this season.
Well, I mean, you look at the Commanders. So I've been thinking about this. You look at the Commanders' schedule. Obviously, they have the Giants back to back. If the Giants win one game, they have a good chance of making the playoffs.
Yeah, let's say they split, because that's the most reasonable thing to say for both teams, right?
If the Giants split, then I look at that Colts game as a possibility, and I also look at that Eagles game, the last game of the year for the Giants, as a way for the Giants to get to 9 and maybe have the chance to get to 10 to really just slam the door shut on making the playoffs. If the Giants win both games against the Commanders, you can book your ticket to the playoffs. I would feel very confident that 9 wins with all the rest of the games to go, they would do it. What I think is interesting for the Commanders, and then I'll get back to the Seattle piece of it, is if the Commanders split against the Giants, they've got the 49ers, as you mentioned, still fighting for their playoff spot. You've got the Browns with Deshaun Watson. He's going to want to show out. And then that final game against the Cowboys, the Cowboys will have the number 1 wild card spot locked up. They can't move up. If the Eagles are already where they're at, they may not have much to play for either. That game can get a little bit tricky for the Giants. So that's why you have to get at least one against Washington. When you look at the Seattle piece of it, Seattle plays the Carolina Panthers this upcoming. They play the Rams and then the Panthers in the next 2 weeks. That could be 2 wins for Seattle right out of the gate, which means if they get one more, that means Seattle would be at 9, and they have the head-to-head against the Giants, which means the Giants would have to get to 10. So that's what worries me most, is actually Seattle, where you look at it and say, man, if they get those next 2 games, they could lose to the 49ers, Chiefs, Jets, and still have the Rams to get one more game at the end of the season. The schedule does not favor the Giants. We talk about how tough it is for the Giants. It looks pretty good for Seattle, and the Giants need to win one more game than Seattle.
Yeah, and don't forget too, we always, because when you look at the standings, you may be saying, I know that the Giants lost both games to the Cowboys, but they only have one more win. Well, they're up 2 in the loss column, and the Cowboys are going to host the Colts, host the Texans, and then go on the road for the Jacksonville Jaguars before they close out their season with the Eagles at Tennessee and then at Washington at the end of the year. But just realistically, it's like, hey, they're 8 wins. They're probably getting to 10 in the next 2 weeks reasonably. So it's like kind of why you push that. Technically, you could make the argument, right? Like, oh, depending on what happens. But unfortunately, their schedule breaks the right way for them, and losing both head-to-head matchups really hurts you.
I'll give you one more crazy thing to think about. So the NFL decides to put divisional matchups as the last week of the season to make sure that there's as many competitive games as humanly possible. The Giant fans are hoping that the Eagles have nothing to play for, which would mean their backups are in, which would give us a better chance to win, not necessarily just, lock it in. But in that same breath, if the Eagles have nothing to play for, it means the Dallas Cowboys would have nothing to play for. They'd be locked into the number 1 wildcard spot, and they play the Commanders, who the Giants desperately need to lose games. So if the Eagles have nothing to play for, that means the Cowboys have nothing to play for, which means it negates the advantage that you'd have against the Commanders in that last week. I know I'm going crazy on this, but it's like, whether those games are important or not, it's going to come out in the wash for the Giants and the Commanders.
Let's go deeper, Andrew. Let's have more fun. Let's not make it about the games not mattering. Let's say that the Philadelphia Eagles, who host the Tennessee Titans, lose this upcoming week. Then they are at the Giants. And we're going to see how the Giants play against the Commanders before we start to think about how competitive we might be able to be. We all understand. We're kind of putting those ones to the side. They go at Chicago. You think that they're going to get those 2 wins. But just if the Eagles were to lose this week against the Titans, even winning both those games against us and Chicago, then they go to Dallas. Like, at least for a moment, there will be a game on there if Dallas wins their next 2 games where winning that matchup actually starts to all of a sudden say, well, maybe the division is not totally decided here for the NFC East. Maybe there is something to play for, right? They would be a 2-loss team and at that point, a 3-loss team in Dallas, at which point you could have the Giants and the Commanders, both of them needing to win their final game to maybe secure their wild card spot or not make the playoffs. And maybe it is that Dallas actually needs to beat the Commanders to maybe get the division. And therefore the Eagles do have to play us. And I know that that's a bit of a sad potential prospect for the Giants fans, but at the same time, you mentioned it, division games to end the year. How exciting would it be if it actually meant something for everyone, right? Like if it mattered in different forms and fashion for every single team playing that day, that'd be something that the NFC East has not been able to say in a long, long time.
At the end of the day, Adam, division games are critical. They are the most important, which is why this upcoming Commanders game at home for the Giants is enormous. I told you before, if the Giants win this game, they probably go up to 75% chance to make the playoffs. This is important. This is the one game that you feel like you have to have on the schedule, not only because it's a division game, but it's against a team that is competing for that final wild card spot. I am, my family's going to be there. I'm working on being there for the game, potentially live, to yell and scream, knowing how important this game might be, Adam. But man, oh man, I am getting jazzed up. Tomorrow we'll come in. We'll talk a little bit about the matchup itself, betting lines, maybe my bet of the week that just missed last week. And we'll give probably our predictions, right?
You better believe it, man. On Sunday, you're going to have Atlanta playing at 1 o'clock, that low-level 18% chance team. You're going to have the Washington Commanders coming to play, obviously, our New York Football Giants. The Tennessee Titans are playing at 1 o'clock against the Eagles, and then Seattle plays at 4, right? San Francisco also plays at 4, hosting Miami. So all these games, it's like you're going to know, first and foremost, do the Giants handle their own business? And then we're going to have that trickle-down effect of what's happening in the background. Did we have a loss and we need some other teams to fall by the wayside? Or did we win and those other teams losing can almost just say, wow, the dream within a dream scenario that maybe the Giants don't have all the pressure in the world in that final week of the season. We'll continue to break it all down tomorrow. We'll see where OBJ lands here as he comes in for his visit day with New York Football Giants. You find us on YouTube, subscribe, obviously, and share that. Get it on the comments. You get the podcast needs wherever you get those fulfilled. If it's on Apple, leave us a glowing review. Why don't you? It really means a lot to us as we continue to see our numbers grow. Until next time, friends, as always, and as Andy Makowitz would want, need, and nay, demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.